And now, lovely listener, I'm afraid we bring you a really very sad story indeed. As you've been hearing in the news this morning, it has emerged that a woman's body lay undiscovered in her flat in Peckham for 2.5 years. And that is despite repeated calls by her neighbours for somebody to do something about this. An inquest heard yesterday that no one had seen or heard from Sheila Celioni since August 2019. BBC Radio London's Harry Lowe was at the inquest and he joins me this morning. Harry, what a sad story, isn't it?
Yeah, it's tragic. The fact that somebody could die and really be seemingly unnoticed, certainly by her landlord in this case. I must say, you might think listening to this, what were the neighbours doing?
Yeah.
And the neighbours were doing everything in their power, as far as I can tell, and as far as the coroner could rule, to flag this up to the housing association. But their cries for help, if you like, were largely falling on deaf ears.
So what do we know about this story? What do we know, for example, about Sheila Celioni? What kind of a person was she? How old was she? What did she do in London? All those sorts of things.
Yeah, she was born in January 1960. We know that. And we know, therefore, the coroner says that he has to conclude, because she was found in February this year by police, or I say she was found, her skeleton in reality was found, that he has to conclude she died age 61. But of course, we know that her last known contact with anybody when she was alive was with her GP in August of 2019, the 14th of August. And after that, there really is nothing to indicate that she'd had any contact with anybody. If you walk into the block, which I did about 3 months ago, you see on the ground floor of this 3-storey block, her postbox overflowing with letters, overflowing with mail. So that would be the first red flag for me, or potentially for a landlord, that something's gone wrong. The neighbours who I spoke to after the inquest yesterday, and by the way, they've said they're shocked and disappointed by what we heard yesterday. The downstairs neighbour could see maggots. She had flies in her flat. The neighbour right opposite her said they could smell what she described as a foul stench. So there was no question that something hadn't quite gone right. But effectively what happened was, after that last contact with her GP in August of 2019, she stopped paying rent. We heard at the inquest yesterday from Peabody that, unlike most people who pay for their housing by direct debit, Miss Celioni actually paid hers manually by credit card or debit card every month. So that stopped in August 2019. And in March of 2020, Peabody, the housing association, applied for universal credit to cover the cost of her rent. So from that point onwards... Without
speaking to her,
no,
asking her, getting any response from her at all.
No, and you're absolutely right to raise that as a point, because as a landlord, you have a duty every year to complete a gas safety check on the property. Every 12 months, that must happen. Now, obviously, we all remember March 2020 as being lockdown 1 and the country ground to a halt. What the Housing Association did manage to do was cap her gas supply, i.e. cut it off. So although they hadn't heard from her, they decided to cut off her gas supply, despite having had no word from her at all. It wasn't until October of 2020 when the residents again went to the police and phoned them and said, please come and check this out. The stench by that point had left the building. There was no smell. But the police turned up at the door and didn't feel that under Section 17 powers, and these are powers which are designed to, in the police's words, arrest persons or to save life, limb or property, they did not deem that this was something that fell into that category. So they went on the 15th of October 2020 at the request of the residents. They then went a week later at the request of Peabody. And here's where it went wrong, because at the police end, somebody in the control centre, who no longer works for the Metropolitan Police, retired last year and therefore cannot face disciplinary action, but we're told at the inquest yesterday would have faced disciplinary action, passed the message back to Peabody that she was seen alive and well. At that point, Peabody conclude that the resident is still there and that she's absolutely fine. And so that's how we ended up going on a whole nother 14 months until February of this year before she was found. So a catalogue of errors.
So somebody,
Vanessa.
It wasn't an error. I mean, somebody lied deliberately. I mean, you can't say you saw someone if you didn't see them, if they're dead, can you?
Neither of the officers who attended that property said that they saw her alive and well. It was a conversation between somebody in the control room and somebody else who was assessing a report. So that's where the miscommunication has come. And the police have actually, to their credit, if you like, have recognised that this shouldn't happen again. And they've made 6 recommendations. We heard from one of their senior officers yesterday to change their processes. And Peabody, as you can imagine, they've apologised to the residents in the block, and they've admitted that they could have joined the dots earlier. And that's an understatement, isn't it, given what we've just heard?
So what led them in the end to break into the flat and to find out that she had not just died, but that she'd been dead for 2.5 years? It's really, really sad and awful story, isn't it?
Awful story. The police were called yet again in February of this year, and at this point they decided that actually they did have Section 17 powers, and it was necessary to break into the flat. And I've actually been to the flat and seen it myself, flat 16 of Lord's Court in Peckham, and you could see there were flowers, there was artwork at the door, but there's still the cracks in the door where the police had forced entry. She was found, and I won't go into too much graphic detail because I know some people will be eating their breakfast, but she was found, the police officer says, in the recovery position. It was very difficult to identify her. In fact, the only way she was identified, Vanessa, is via dental records 2 weeks later.
This is awful, isn't it?
Yeah, it was an immaculately kept flat, the police have told us. She did suffer, we know, from Crohn's disease. She also had an inflammatory bowel issue.
Yeah.
So there's some suggestion in court, and of course we couldn't have a definitive ruling on it because she was found so long after she was last seen, but that perhaps may have in some way been something she was suffering with. The police made reference to perhaps some soiled clothing that may have indicated she was in some distress before she died, but she was found in a skeletal state, but wearing blue pyjamas and a white shirt. The police officer concluded that she probably had died in August of 2019 because he found a receipt in her bag for August 2019, and he found prescription medications, as well as, he said, the shorter shelf life of the food that he found in her fridge was for a dessert, and that had a date of August 2019. So he concluded that in all likelihood that is when she had passed away.
I think the thing that people will just feel so terribly sad about is the idea that nobody missed her, because to die, unmissed, for there not to be a friend, a neighbour, a work colleague, a family member, an old school pal, somebody who tries to contact you, realises you're not picking up your phone or realises you're not answering your door, and then raises the alarm. I mean, the extent of that loneliness is absolutely overpowering, and it's heartbreaking, isn't it?
It is.
To think you could, God forbid, die,
Yes.
and 2.5 years later, nobody has asked anybody where you are. It's just awful. Do we know anything at all about her life?
No, we don't. No real details were revealed at the inquest.
Sad.
It's everyone's worst nightmare, isn't it, Vanessa?
Yes.
You asked earlier why and how it came that in February of 2022, this year, police came to the door because her balcony doors were swinging open. There was a large storm. I forget the name of it now, but that storm blew open the balcony doors, and that's why the downstairs neighbours said, "Can you please have a look upstairs? Something is not right here."
Yeah.
I spoke to two of the residents. They didn't want to be named after the inquest yesterday. And the one who had maggots in her flat said she was in a state of shock and disappointment. She said there's no excuse for why Peabody didn't do something before the pandemic. There's a lot of things that have been missed that they didn't consider. Another resident who lives on her floor, who first reported this foul stench in September of 2019, she said that their concerns were not taken seriously. It doesn't make sense to me, she said, that she had no one. No one noticed she was missing. There are still so many unanswered questions, so many gaps. More could have been done. It's not been good enough. And perhaps the most damning verdict came from the coroner himself, Dr. Julian Morris. He said this: "Any death is sad.
Yes.
To lie undetected for, in all likelihood, over 2 years is difficult to fathom in 2022.
It really is, isn't it? And actually, it remains a great mystery, doesn't it? Who this lady was, how she lived, what she liked to do, where she used to go, why nobody realised and nobody noticed. It's believed she had a brother, possibly incarcerated, so we don't know, so it might have been that they weren't close.
She had a half-brother.
Yes, and it's thought that she was a temp, is that right? A secretarial temp?
Yeah, I think so. That detail wasn't revealed. That has been reported elsewhere,
Yes.
that she was. I should say that Peabody has issued a 27-page report, which I've got in front of me, and has only just been seen for the first time today. And there's quite a lot of recommendations, some of which they said yesterday are already in place. I'll just give you two
Please
of them off the top
yes.
of my head.
Yes.
We conclude that there were missed opportunities where there may have been opportunities to discover the body at an earlier point when contact was attempted and not followed through. These opportunities range from the change in behaviour when rent payments suddenly ceased, as I say, in August 2019, concerns raised by neighbours, multiple attempts to contact the resident, specifically regarding rent payment and gas servicing, several reports into the customer hub of smells and one of maggots and flies, and various other
Things that you're not going to say on the
Other
radio
things
because
that
they're
I
too
won't.
distressing.
Quite, but they have said that they're changing their policies, Vanessa.
Yes.
That's what they've
But
decided
may I
to
ask
do.
you something else? I mean, housing associations, do they not have some kind of pastoral stroke social role? And therefore, if somebody were to take a flat you were to give somebody, or they were to pay to have a flat in a housing association property, I would have thought that you would have had to interview them, discuss with them what it is they do for a living, how they're going to make the payments that they make of rent. So they would have to know who this person was and know something about her. So when I say, was she a temp? We think so. Do you know what she did? No. Did she have any friends or social life? I don't know. We don't know. But I would have thought that they would have had to know. It would have been part of their remit to know. Is that not true?
Well, I think perhaps when she moved in February 2014, so
Yes.
5 years before that,
Yes.
that those checks were made, and she had been a model tenant, as we heard from one of the neighbourhood managers yesterday. She'd paid her rent on time every single month. She had always allowed them into the building for repairs and gas safety checks. It was only really in the summer of 2019 when things started to unravel, or something wasn't right, and basically Peabody did not connect the dots, and they've admitted they should have connected the dots. But in reality, there is a neighbourhood manager, but neighbourhood managers can manage up to 1,200 properties.
Right.
And when you've got something that is on that scale, somebody in charge of so many properties, this kind of thing can slip through the cracks. Peabody's saying, by the way, that this won't happen again, and they've contacted every single person on all of their estates who they haven't heard from in the last 12 months, and they say there are only 9 people left who they haven't yet heard from in the last 12 months. So this has, obviously an awful case, and you wouldn't wish this on anybody, but perhaps if something comes from it, it's that there'll be some changes both in how the police go about this and how Peabody managed other
I
homes.
hesitate to say this because I don't necessarily think it's true, but some people might think that in London we have a sort of I don't know what it is, such a kind of frenzied, frenetic style of living that we don't notice our neighbours. We don't speak to them from one year to the next. We wouldn't know. And also people live in buildings in which neighbours come and go, and there's Airbnb, and then there are sub-rentals, and some of them are illegal, and people, you're not necessarily expecting to recognise your neighbour. You're not expecting to say good morning or notice if they take their rubbish out or know their name or know whether they take sugar. You just won't know. We pass, like ships in the night, even our closest physically neighbours. And I don't know if that's just London or all big cities, or indeed actually everywhere, or whether it's a kind of British thing to just keep yourself to yourself and not really talk to somebody who doesn't talk to you. But the idea of living so close to somebody who's been in that building since 2014, who's made regular payments, who obviously does work for a living, must come in, go out, must take rubbish out, must, shelter from the rain and put the umbrella in and out and all this kind of a thing, and just not realise that this person is dead right next door. It's really just so sad, isn't it? So lonely.
Terribly sad.
So sorry.
And reminiscent of Joyce Vincent Green, who died in Wood Green about 10 years ago, and she lay undiscovered for a long time also.
Yes.
And it's clear that we thought these things wouldn't and couldn't still happen in 2022, and as the coroner says, they can.
Very sad, Harry. Thank you very much indeed for telling us the story, even though, as you probably realised there, lovely listener, Harry had to sort of edit various details of that story and decided what he would say and what he wouldn't say, just really to spare the feelings of people listening, because it's just so desperately sad and so graphic and so gruesome. And I thank you for doing that. That was a kind of sensitive way of telling such a sad story. Somebody who just lay there dead for 2.5 years in a flat in Peckham.